Welcome to my talk. Now, Paul and Mel talked about wise disease, and now I want to talk about wise health, which will obviously be closely related to their talk. I'm pleased to be here. After all, I did my PhD with Paul, was funded by this great project on having an account of health in the 21st century, and I'll try to bring these strands of my work here together again. Now, to begin with this topic, we can clearly recognize that health is not just a property that humans have, but is really something shared with all animals. In fact, probably with trees, plants, microbiological organisms. They can be more or less healthy, even if some normativists might disagree or think that is largely due to human value judgments rather than some more intrinsic properties of the organisms. But I think looking at pictures like these, it seems fairly clear that it does seem something almost purely biological going wrong, right? We don't have to add human value judgments here necessarily. So Paul and Mel really urge us on to think about why diseases exist, rather than just to think about how we define them. And similarly, I want to ask why health exists. And I want to explain this in terms of what I've called pathological complexity. So really, we want to ask this question, why is there no Garden in Eden in which all species are healthy? And the goal of this talk is to show that only a naturalist conception can accommodate what we might want from a health concept without leading us into trouble. It's to be preferred over, say, the elimination of this very concept because people just use it in so many different ways that it isn't a single concept that could unify all these usages and goals of how we talk about it. So how do I define health? Well, in a couple of places I've defended the view that health is simply a measure of how optimally an organism deals with the pathological complexity trade-off it faces during its life cycle. Or to put it differently, how well an organism succeeds in its species-specific life history strategy. We can think here of pathological complexity as life history complexity, though I intend it in a broader way than just trade-offs between fecundity and survival. More broadly about all the trade-offs organisms face in the pursuit of fitness maximization, with that being their goal. It is a very evolutionary view of what health is, a design view. And it stands in contrast, perhaps, with a view of a Garden of Eden, where all animals and humans are happy and healthy. There's a nice Simpsons episode where Homer is in paradise and a pig offers to give him some bacon, and he just takes it out of its belly. The pig doesn't have any problem with it, doesn't impede its health or happiness. But that is not how the actual biological world is. In fact, perhaps there's something impossible about this very idea. Right? Perhaps in nature, we will inevitably find healthy and pathological specimen. That's just what it means to have some varieties that aren't conducive to species survival. Now, what is health? Well, traditional answer in the philosophy of medicine has largely been the absence of disease, though with some important exceptions, of course. But the problem with this view is largely that health cannot be the mere absence of disease. Some normativists have, in fact, already pointed this out. That can't just be the absence of things going wrong or badly for organs. Some breakdown of function anywhere in some cells of the body is simply unavoidable, right? Even if in very juvenile organisms, you'll find cells that are perhaps malfunctioning, perhaps in very minor ways, but you'll find some forms of breakdown. Some cells aren't quite the way they're supposed to be. The immune system can often handle this, but nevertheless, there is something inevitable about this. And this is not just about aging, that some things will inevitably start to go wrong as the system ages, but simply the fact that trade-offs are inevitable. Think of the immune system. In order to be able to kill all cancer cells, you'd have to kill all cells of an organism. Similarly, in order to not kill any normal cells, healthy cells, you wouldn't be able to kill any cancer cells, right? Biology is messy. There's type 1 and type 2 errors, and biological processes have to deal with a lot of trade-offs. And that is why we're vulnerable to what we might consider diseases. Why not everything is going perfect, like in the Garden of Eden? Now, importantly, such an account of health can also not answer why one organism is healthier than another. We might say something like one organism having more intact teeth versus another, but thinking across different dimensions, perhaps such as broken bones versus cancer, that really doesn't work. So health comes in degrees in several dimensions. It's not just an on or off matter, and it's fundamentally about success. Fundamentally, I argue about evolutionary success. Now, I've defended a view like this in several places. I'm happy for you to look at these chapters, my dissertation, articles, where I've tried to defend this view in more detail. And in principle, one argument I've made is that we can broadly distinguish two views, right? One is a broadly naturalist and normativist view, where health is the pursuit of life goals or happiness in spite of diseases or any other pathological conditions, for that matter, to think more broadly about it. But then a broadly naturalist view is very different, where health is success in the sense of fitness maximization or being at a design optimum. So you can see here this contrast between these two views, where one is about the goals of the subject, right, as a conscious creature, an agent, versus the goals of an organism. And these do not seem to necessarily align. After all, we might prefer to drink alcohol, someday eat unhealthy food. We might prefer not to have the maximum amount of children, right? So these goals can come apart. It seems very clear. So one can have high biological fitness without ever being happy. A lot of mammals, mothers, might not be very happy about their juvenile offspring, trying to get a lot of milk out of them, right? It's tough being a mom, whether you're human or a non-human animal. And similarly, animals that are unhealthy can nevertheless be happy. So normativists sometimes point this out, others are perhaps skeptical about this. But we should distinguish these notions. I think that is very important. And there's a problem, which I already raised, that is that the meaning of the term health in the public sphere is terribly polysemous, vague and ambiguous. So it's very unclear that it could possibly be one account that covers all of its usages, or for that matter, the various goals of discourse. So the normativist usage captures a variety of very different concepts, as happiness, flourishing, social evaluations, and the like that are themselves used in a variety of ways without any hope of consensus. This might lead us to raise the question of whether we should eliminate this concept altogether. In fact, I think that is a compelling alternative if it wasn't for the fact that there is hope for a single naturalist account, where the correctness conditions are ultimately determined by biology rather than consensus, right? So it captures this common intuition that health and pathology are natural phenomena, and there's something onto this, even though some philosophers of biology, such as Tim Lewins, have criticized this, saying an evolutionary view makes pathology hostage to evolutionary inquiry and being critical of this. However, I think it's precisely what we need if we want to keep the concept of health as something useful for the future. Konrad Lorenz, in fact, pointed out very early that we need something like a concept of health and pathology in order to do biology. In order to distinguish healthy and pathological varieties, only then can we have something like a Darwinian science of behavior. So he very early argued that one needs a finely developed sensitivity to this difference between not quite normal, already pathological differences that any scientific animal people must possess. And he was praising Heinroth as the true founder of ethology for having this background as a medical doctor and applying this knowledge within the science. And of course, saying that about himself, that his Lorenz's educational background also came from medicine, later turning to biology more generally. So why is health? It's simply analogous to the question of why there are no Darwinian demons. That is, why aren't there organisms that produce immediately after being born, live forever without breaking down, and produce infinite offspring? The answer is constraints and trade-offs, as Paul Mael pointed out. So to get the term pathological complexity clear, it's the computational teleonomic complexity of the fitness maximization problem in a generalized state-based and behavioral life history theory. So this goes beyond trade-offs between survival and fecundity to really include all trade-offs you might have. So optimal foraging, Fourier phenotypic trade-offs, and the like. Really care about where's the optimum for the species, and then the optimum will be a strategy that's being implemented. So, right, we couldn't have this nice graph here where all life history strategies are defined by a schedule, starting from life, birth, whether it starts by fission and cloning and the like, towards a goal, thus maximizing lifetime reproductive output. We can have more or less complex strategies we might have more things going wrong. You can take a look at some ways of trying to formalize this here, and then further coming out of collaborations with life history theorists at Oxford. Now, there are new problems, however. That is the first one, which is a common objection, that naturalist views don't seem to justify medical treatments or tell us which conditions should be medicalized. And there's three responses one can give. Firstly, it is simply a matter of fact that most pathological conditions create suffering and hinder us in the pursuit of our interests, right? So there's a deep empirical and evolutionary connection here rather than conceptual. And I have argued that evolution of positive and negative subjective experiences can in fact closely be linked to how they help organisms evolve, what is adapt to what is harmful, try to avoid that, and seek out what is beneficial. You don't need this conceptual connection here. The second response is that medicine, as well as veterinary science, is already not concerned with pathology per se. That is actually a misunderstanding, but really with pathologies that create the most suffering, stand in the way of individual, or say, capitalist interests, where we might say try to care about health in virtue of how it might impact farming produce, how much milk is being produced, right? So already health isn't really what we're going for. The third response is that doctors can be experts about health and pathologies while focusing on those that we disvalue the most without making that disvaluation part of the definition of these terms. Just like, say, conservationists can be experts about threats of humans to species while focusing on preserving those species we might care about most. There isn't any difficulty here in trying to distinguish these two notions. Now, another problem, however, might be that health and pathology do not seem to be purely value neutral. The first response to this is, well, they do not have to be biological concepts. Societal treatments of pathology, stigma, discrimination, and like human values here, what counts as bad or to be avoided, form part of our selective environments, right? So the values we have towards people with disabilities influence how people with disabilities will have success, right? In having offspring, say, having access to resources in our society. So they very much change the pathological complexity trade-offs that Homo sapiens faces. Think of the invention of glasses or medicine itself. It simply changes how pathological certain states are for humans, right? It really changes the adaptive pressures. And secondly, the fact that ill, disabled, and diseased people are often mistreated and not accommodated is very much due to the common fallacy that these states are morally bad or intrinsically bad for people as subjects and not just biologically so, right? People very often overestimate how bad someone with a certain disability perhaps might judge their life to be going, when often they rate it to be going very well. So there's this common conflation of the biological values and the subjective values of how people evaluate their lives. And here the problem is that really naturalism is really the only game in town in order to really promise social justice. But it's very much severing this connection, rather than as some normativists argue, such as Kugler, to vindicate this fallacy by building moral values into the definitions of health and disease. This would require us to already know what the right values are, but if we think this might change in the future, we will harm people if we build the wrong values into these concepts. And this has already happened in the past. So to conclude, the question of why we need a concept of health, it simply offers so many distinct answers that no possible definition could account for all the uses or intended uses of the term, right? All the goals for this way of talking. Normativists cannot possibly solve this problem, leading us in the direction of eliminating the concepts altogether. And here we need a conceptual divorce of well-being and flourishing as concept of moral and prudential value from health as a purely biological notion. Now, a purely biological view is in fact possible and desirable, bridging a number of scientific fields, in fact being even necessary to conduct some of the studies in this field, such as evolutionary biology, and it vindicates the intuition that health and biology are in fact natural phenomena. Health is simply a measure of how optimally an organism deals with the pathological complexity trade-offs it faces. And normativism, on the other hand, is self-defeating. It attempts to put the right values into a purely biological view of health that only vindicates the harmful idea that it must be bad for subjects to be unhealthy. But that is not necessarily the case, even if it is mostly happening, right? It's a matter of fact, an evolutionary fact about life. And social justice then finally requires a purely biological view of health and disease that recognizes how human society itself can change the pathological complexity trade-offs our species faces. And this will allow medical professionals to use their expertise in the future to improve well-being, whether or not something is considered pathological, thus leading to more social justice. So thanks for listening to this talk, here my references, and thanks for your attention.